Margot Ellison had a rule she never broke. She did not give second chances to people who showed her exactly who they were the first time. 43 years in business had taught her that. So had one marriage, one divorce, and a daughter who hadn't called in 6 years. You learn eventually to read people quickly. You learn that most of them will tell you everything you need to know if you just stop talking long enough to pay attention. The test was her idea. It always had been. She sat behind her desk on the 42nd floor and looked out at Cleveland the way she always did in the mornings. Slowly, without hurry, like the city owed her something and she was content to wait for it. The lake was gray that Tuesday. The buildings caught the early light wrong. Somewhere down there, 4 men were about to receive a phone call that would change things for them, though only one of them would understand what was really happening. Margot Ellison had built her first company at 26 with $11,000 and a borrowed conference room. She had sold it at 31 for 8 figures. She had built 3 more after that. She was not the kind of woman who appeared on magazine covers or gave commencement speeches. She preferred to be underestimated. It was more useful that way. For the past 14 months, she had been watching the 4 candidates for the regional director position at Ellison Capital Group. She had read their files. She had sat in on meetings where they didn't know she was observing. She had seen how they treated assistants, how they behaved at the end of long days when they thought no one important was watching, and she had narrowed it down to 4. Now she wanted to know who they actually were. Her assistant, a composed young woman named Petra, had made the calls that morning. Each man was told the same thing. Mr. Ellison, a name Margot still used for business when she didn't want the gender to become the story, was extending a goodwill gesture to each of the final candidates. A corporate card had been couriered to their home addresses. It carried no spending limit. It was valid for exactly 72 hours. There was no guidance on how to use it. That was the point. She had done this twice before in her career. The first time, a man had bought himself a boat. The second time, a woman had quietly paid off her mother's medical debt and said nothing about it until Margot brought it up herself. That woman was now the CFO of Ellison Capital's Western Division. Margot poured herself a second cup of coffee and waited. The first card went to a man named Garrett. He was 38, Yale MBA, the kind of confident that reads as competence until you spend enough time around it to notice it was just volume. He had a firm handshake and very good shoes, and he spoke in meetings the way some people played chess. Always 3 moves ahead, always angling. His colleagues respected him the way you respect something sharp, carefully, and from a distance. Garrett activated the card before 9 in the morning. By noon, he had booked a suite at a downtown hotel for the coming weekend, reserved a table at a restaurant that required 2 months' notice on a normal day, and placed a deposit on a fishing charter in the Florida Keys for March. He told himself these were investments in relationships. Client entertainment broadly construed. He was the sort of man who was very good at explaining his own behavior in language that made it sound like strategy. He didn't think about the test once. That, more than anything else, would tell Margot what she needed to know. The second card went to a man named Fletcher. He was 44, regional sales background, self-made in the way that people sometimes mean when they're filling out a form and there's no better word. He had grown up in Akron and gone to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and worked harder than most people Margot had ever met. He was not flashy. He wore the same 3 blazers in rotation. His presentations were thorough and slightly too long, and he cared too much about being liked, which was a vulnerability, but not necessarily a disqualifying one. Fletcher spent the first day doing nothing. He stared at the card on his kitchen counter for several hours, the way you stare at something that might be a trap. He called his wife Patricia, and they talked about it in the kitchen after the kids were in bed. He said he didn't feel right about it. She said it was probably fine. He said probably wasn't the same as definitely. They went back and forth. He didn't sleep well. On the second day, he booked a family vacation to Washington, D.C. for spring break. His son had a history project on the Lincoln Memorial. His daughter had been asking about the Smithsonian since she was 7. He spent $600 on it and felt guilty about the other $99,400 he hadn't touched. So he donated $1,000 to his church's food pantry and put the card back in his desk drawer. The third card went to a man named Russell. He was 36, numbers-oriented, the kind of analyst who made other analysts feel inadequate. He had no shortage of intelligence and even less shortage of self-awareness about that intelligence, which made him both very effective and occasionally difficult to be in a room with. His mind was always running a parallel calculation. He was never fully present because he was always optimizing. Russell bought things, not extravagant things exactly. He was too careful for extravagance. But over the 72 hours he accumulated a new laptop, a standing desk, a set of noise-canceling headphones, several online courses he fully intended to complete, a year's worth of a project management software subscription, and a high-end espresso machine that he rationalized as a work-from-home productivity investment. He was thorough and systematic about it. He kept a spreadsheet. When the card expired, he felt satisfied. He had been efficient. That was the word he used when he thought about it later. Efficient. None of them noticed the courier. All 4 cards had a small clause embedded in the terms, not hidden, just not highlighted, that authorized Petra's office to request itemized receipts from the issuing bank every 24 hours. It was how Margot had always done it. She didn't want to catch anyone doing something wrong. She wanted to see what they did when they thought they were free. The 4th card went to a man named Calvin Mercer. He was 41 years old, and he lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Tremont neighborhood with his son, who was 9, and sometimes with his mother, who came and went depending on her health. He had been with Ellison Capital for 6 years. Before that, he had spent 3 years doing financial consulting for a nonprofit that served low-income families, which was the job he had wanted and the job that had paid him approximately nothing. He had taken the corporate position because his wife had gotten sick and the insurance was better. His wife had died 4 years ago on a Tuesday in February, and Calvin had gotten up on Wednesday and taken Marcus to school and come to work, and he had not missed a single day since. This was not in his file. Margot had found it out a different way. Her assistant had mentioned it offhandedly once, and Margot had sat with it for a long time afterward. Calvin received the card on a Monday morning. He read the letter twice, set it on the counter, and got Marcus his breakfast. He dropped Marcus at school and drove to work. He sat at his desk and did his job. He did not use the card. That evening, after he picked Marcus up and made dinner and helped with homework and got through bath time and the negotiation about one more chapter that always lasted longer than the chapter itself, Calvin sat at the kitchen table and thought about it. He thought about a lot of things in the quiet after Marcus was asleep. That was the time of day that had been hardest to learn. The quiet. Jenna had loved the quiet. She used to say it was when you could finally hear yourself think. Now when it got quiet, Calvin sometimes had to put on the radio just to keep the room from feeling too large. He looked at the card. He thought about the things he could buy. He made a list, the way Jenna had always made lists. She had been a list person, organized in ways that made him look scattered by comparison. And he looked at the list and felt nothing particular about any of it. A new car, a better apartment, money set aside for Marcus's college. These were all real things. He was not without wants. But there was something else he kept thinking about. There was a woman at Marcus's school named Mrs. Okafor. She ran the after-school program, and she was, in Calvin's quiet estimation, the most competent and underappreciated person he had ever met. She worked from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and she brought her own lunch because the cafeteria food disagreed with her, and she remembered the name of every child in that building and what they were working on and what they were afraid of. For 3 years, since Jenna died, Mrs. Okafor had been the person who noticed when Marcus was having a hard day. She would send Calvin a text. Just, Marcus seemed a little down today. He's okay. Just wanted you to know. That was it. She never made it a bigger thing than it was. She just made sure he knew. Calvin had tried to thank her properly several times. She always waved it off. He also thought about a family in his building. 2nd floor, apartment 2C, the Hendersons. Ray Henderson had been laid off in October and was still looking, and his wife Karen worked at a laundry on West 25th, and their youngest, a girl named Becca, who was 6, had started wearing the same coat every day that was clearly a size too small because the zipper didn't close all the way. Calvin had offered to help once, and Ray had declined the way proud men decline things, not angrily, just quietly, with a finality that meant don't ask again. Calvin had respected that, but there were other ways to help. On Tuesday morning, Calvin called the school's main office and spoke to the administrative coordinator. He asked, carefully, because he knew how these things needed to be asked, whether the after-school program had an equipment wish list. It did. Mrs. Okafor had submitted it 2 years ago, and it had been sitting in a queue ever since. Art supplies, educational games, a replacement projector, outdoor learning materials. The total was just under $4,000. Calvin ordered everything on the list and had it shipped to the school. He did not tell Mrs. Okafor. He arranged it through the office and asked them not to say where it came from. Then he drove to a children's clothing store on Lorraine Avenue and spent an hour picking out a winter coat in the right size for a 6-year-old girl, along with 2 sets of thermal underlayers and a pair of boots. and he put it all in a bag and left it outside apartment 2C with a note that said only, "For Becca." From a neighbor. He did not sign it. He went back upstairs and made coffee and sat at the table and felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not pride, closer to relief. Like something had been sitting at an angle for a long time and had finally been set straight. He still had most of the card's limit left. On Wednesday, his mother called. She had been having trouble with the medication, the cost of it, not the medication itself. She had been cutting the pills in half for 3 months, which Calvin hadn't known. And she mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, sideways, embedded in a longer story about something else entirely, so that you almost missed it if you weren't listening carefully. Calvin was always listening carefully when his mother talked. He drove to her pharmacy that afternoon. He spoke to the pharmacist, a patient man named David who knew his mother by name. He got the full list of her prescriptions and paid 3 months forward and set up an automatic refill. His mother called him that evening and told him he was too much, and he told her she wasn't enough, and they went back and forth like that for 20 minutes the way they always had, which was its own kind of love. On Thursday morning, the card expired. Calvin looked at it for a moment. He thought about whether he'd done the right things. He thought about Marcus asleep down the hall, and Mrs. Okafor's Tuesday text, and Becca Henderson's coat, and his mother's voice on the phone. He put the card in the kitchen drawer and went to make breakfast. He had not bought himself a single thing. Margot read the reports on Friday. Petra had organized them cleanly, the way she organized everything, in order of the card number, not the candidate's name, which meant Margot didn't know whose report she was reading until she turned to the summary page. This was intentional. She had asked for it this way. She didn't want to read with expectations. She read Garrett's first. She read it for about 4 minutes. She set it down. She read Fletcher's. She spent more time on it. The family vacation was sincere. The church donation was sincere. She thought about him for a while. She read Russell's. She thought about efficiency and what it was good for and what it wasn't. Then she read the last one. She read it 3 times. She read about the school supplies and the arrangement through the office and the instruction not to say where it came from. She read about the coat left outside apartment 2C. She read about the pharmacy and the 3-month prescription and the automatic refill. She read about the fact that Calvin Mercer had spent less than $5,000 of an unlimited line of credit, and that all of it had gone to people other than as himself. She sat back in her chair and looked out at the lake for a long time. There was a thing that happened sometimes when you had been in business long enough and had interviewed enough people and read enough files. You started to believe you had seen everything. You started to believe that character was a performance, that people were always angling, that there was always a motive underneath the motive. Margot had believed that more days than not, for the better part of a decade. She looked at the report again. "Do you need anything before I head out?" "No," Margot said. And then, "Petra, pull Calvin Mercer's full file for me, not the HR file, the one we built." Petra nodded and left. Margot sat with the report a little longer. She was thinking about a woman she had never met, a wife who had died on a Tuesday in February, and a man who had gotten up on Wednesday and not stopped. She was thinking about a 9-year-old boy and a neighbor's coat and a pharmacist who knew a woman's name. She was thinking about what it meant to have access to everything and choose to spend it on the people around you who had nothing. She was thinking that she had been right all along, that money told you who a person was. She had just forgotten to consider what it meant when a person barely used it at all. She called him on Monday morning. Calvin was at his desk when the call came through from Petra, and Petra said Mr. Ellison would like to see him this afternoon if he was available, and Calvin said of course, and spent the rest of the morning wondering what he'd done wrong. That was the thing about being the kind of person Calvin was. He always assumed, first, that he had done something wrong. It was a habit from a hard few years, the assumption that something was about to be taken away. At 2 o'clock, he took the elevator to the 42nd floor. He had been up here once before, 2 years ago, for a firm-wide meeting. He remembered the windows. He didn't remember them being this large. Margot Ellison stood when he came in. She was smaller than he expected. He realized he had built up an image of her from reputation alone, and reputation always made people taller. She was 61, slight, with silver hair she wore short, and she looked at him the way experienced people looked at you, not studying exactly, but attending. Present in a way that felt uncommon. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to be honest with me." "Okay," Calvin said. "The card," she said. "You know what I'm talking about." He did not flinch. "Yes." You spent less than $5,000. Yes, on a woman who runs an after-school program, on a child's coat, on your mother's medication. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't think those were secrets. They weren't. That's why I'm asking. She folded her hands on the desk. Why didn't you spend more? There was no ceiling. You could have used it for anything. Calvin thought about that. He thought about the quiet kitchen and the list he had made and the things he had wanted and the things he had actually needed to do. There was a lot I could have bought, he said, but most of it would have just been mine. These were things I could do for people who wouldn't have been able to do them for themselves. That felt like a better use of it. She looked at him for a long time. Marcus, he's 9. You didn't spend anything on him? He has what he needs, Calvin said. He has me. He paused. That sounds like something off a greeting card. But I mean it the way it sounds. Margot was quiet. She thought about the rule she had made. No second chances, read people the first time. And she thought about how long she had held it and whether it had ever actually served her as well as she told herself it did. She thought about the CFO of her Western division and the boat and the spreadsheet and the coat. She thought about a woman named Jenna she had never met, who had raised a man like this, or tried to, before she ran out of time. I want to offer you the regional director position, Margot said, but that's not why I asked you up here. Calvin looked at her. I asked you up here, she said, because I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't often meet someone who gets handed something unlimited and treats it like a responsibility. She slid a folder across the desk. He reached out and opened it slowly, the way you open something when you're not sure what it is. Inside was a single card, laminated, about the size of an index card. On it, in plain type, were 8 words. What you do with plenty reveals who you are. It's the principle I built this company on, Margot said. I have it made for people I meet who already understand it. I don't explain it first. I see whether they arrive at it on their own. She paused. You arrived at it. Calvin held the card. He read the words a second time. He thought about Marcus. He thought about Mrs. Okafor's texts in the middle of the day, short and careful and always arriving exactly when they needed to. He thought about the bag outside apartment 2C and how he had stood in the hallway for a moment before going back upstairs, not knowing exactly what he felt, only that something was righter than it had been before. He thought about Jenna the way he thought about her in the quiet, not painfully, not anymore, just steadily, the way you hold on to something that is part of you even when it isn't there anymore. I'll take the job, he said. Margot nodded once. I thought you might. He stood to leave. At the door, he paused. The school program, he said. Mrs. Okafor. Is there anything through the company? Any kind of community giving? Corporate partnership? Margot looked at him for a long moment. Petra, she said, raising her voice slightly. From the outer office, yes. Add Tremont Elementary to the foundation review list. After school programs, direct support. A pause. Done. Calvin looked at Margot. She was looking out the window at the city, and she was not quite smiling. But something in her face had eased the way a thing eases when it has been carrying weight for a long time and has finally found a reason to set it down. He took the laminated card with him when he left. That evening, he put it on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl where he would see it in the mornings. Marcus asked what it was at breakfast, and Calvin read it aloud, and Marcus listened the way 9-year-olds listen when they're not sure if something is for them or for grown-ups. Then Marcus said, "Is it true?" And Calvin thought about all the ways he could answer this at, and he said, "Yeah, I think it is." And Marcus nodded and went back to his cereal satisfied. The counter still held a photograph. It had been there since February, 4 years ago. Jenna in a yellow jacket, the summer before she got sick, squinting into the sun at some lake they'd driven to on a day when there was nothing planned and nowhere to be. On the back of the photograph, in her handwriting, 8 words. You make everything mean something. Don't forget that. Calvin looked at the photograph and the card and the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and he thought that some things turned out to be true in directions you never expected. He called Marcus to finish his breakfast. They had somewhere to be.